Hi, I'm James Miller, the online ministry specialist at Pine Island United Methodist Church in Pine Island, Minnesota. We're so glad you found this video. If you'd like to see them all, make sure you click subscribe so you don't miss a single one.
Welcome. It's great to have you with us. We are so glad that you found this video. I'm Tony Fink. I'm the pastor appointed to serve the Pine Island, Minnesota area for the United Methodist Church.
And I'm James Miller. I'm the online ministry specialist at Pine Island United Methodist Church.
This week, we begin looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This morning, we're going to focus on what is known as the Beatitudes and what it means to be happy or supremely fortunate as those who live as disciples of Jesus. Now, this is something that we call our Worship Highlights video. This is a shorter version of our worship experience here in Pine Island. If you'd like the complete worship service, that's available on our website. That's at piumc.org.
We're very glad that you've connected with us. If you'd like to say hi to us, you can just click Contact Us at the top of the webpage. And you can also just click the like button on Facebook to let us know that you've stopped by and that you're with us. Speaking of Facebook, that's where we host our digital campus. All kinds of cool stuff there. You'll find a link at that website. One of the things you'll find is that 6 o'clock Central Time on Wednesday nights, we have a digital coffee house. You're invited there every week. Come when you can, leave when you need to.
Yeah. And if you're ever in Pine Island, Minnesota, you can find our address, even the directions to our church on our website. On Sunday mornings, we worship inside at 9 o'clock. We have a parking lot service outside at 10:30. And then between our two services, we have Sunday school for children and youth, and we have a coffee time at 10 o'clock for everyone who's here in person.
And if you ever catch us for the live stream or even just near the end of the hour, you can join us for Digital Coffee Fellowship on Sundays from 10 to 10:30 Central Time that morning. Love to have you there as well. And for right now, we're really glad that you've joined us, and we thank you for joining us for the shorter version of our worship experience this week.
Yeah, we're so glad you're with us. It's our hope, it's our prayer that you will be blessed by this week's video.
Thank you, Jody. We know from last week that Jesus has just finished calling his first disciples. Remember? Simon and Andrew, James and John. And instead of fishing for fish, Jesus is now showing them how to fish for people. Now, in the intervening 2 verses between last week's lesson and this week's lesson, well, Jesus has been traveling through the region of Galilee. Okay? He's been teaching in the synagogues. He's been telling about the good news of the kingdom of heaven that's coming. Jesus has been healing people who had various diseases and pain, demon possession, epilepsy, and paralysis. Okay? I bet that was something for Simon and Andrew and James and John to witness. Imagine being with Jesus and seeing all that just fresh out of the box. And now, Jesus brings them up a mountain and sits down with his new disciples and begins to preach. Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Now, if you were here last November on All Saints Sunday, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. This sounds familiar. Haven't we heard this before? Did you? Yeah, it should sound familiar. Because if you remember, more often than not, the gospel reading for All Saints Sunday is the Beatitudes. So 2 months ago in November, we heard the Gospel of Luke's version from the Sermon on the Plain. And this morning, we are hearing the Gospel of Matthew's version as we begin the Sermon on the Mount. We'll be looking at the Sermon on the Mount for the next couple weeks. Now, again, if you remember back in November, we talked about the Greek word makarios. Okay? Makarios. Now, way back in 1611, we translated makarios as blessed when the King James Bible was written. What year was that? 1611. 400 years later, this is just a coincidence, but 400 years later, in 2011, the Common English Bible comes out. That's the version that we use here in church now, okay? And in 2011, Makarios was translated as happy. Okay? I don't know about you, but happy, I don't like that word. Okay? It's not like the best one for this. But there's a problem here because we don't have a good English translation for makarios. Okay? It's hard going from the Greek to the English. So, again, if we can make up a word that means all at the same time, blessed and happy and rich and fortunate, would be a little bit closer. So this morning, let's just translate it as supremely fortunate. Okay? So with that in mind, hear this. Supremely fortunate are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Supremely fortunate are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Supremely fortunate are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Now, again, at first glance, this might not make sense, because we think, how can a bad thing like being hopeless or being in grief, how can that be something that's supremely fortunate? But let's take a pause here, okay? Think about this. As Jesus is giving his sermon on the mountain right now, is he preaching to the large crowds that have gathered, coming from the region of Galilee and the Decapolis, that's the region of the 10 cities that's just beneath the Sea of Galilee, and then on the other side of the Jordan River? People coming from Jerusalem, people coming from the whole region of Judea. Okay, is Jesus preaching to them, or is Jesus giving this part of the sermon to his new small group of disciples? What do you think? Large crowds or disciples? Go ahead, cheat. Look at the scripture lesson. Disciples. Thanks for paying attention, Rick. You've heard this once before, right? He's speaking. He's now giving his second level class, in addition to preaching about the good news of the kingdom of heaven that's coming and demonstrating his power that he has in healing. Jesus, with a small group, is now teaching about discipleship. Okay, so remember, it's a small group that he's talking to. There's more to the lesson coming down the line. So Jesus could be telling his new followers, Simon and Andrew, James and John, you know, guys, I like you. I'm glad you're with me, and I'm just here to tell you that you're in a really good place. Okay? You're in a really good place when you are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is yours. Right here, you're in a really good place when you grieve, because you will be made glad. You're in a really good place when you are humble, because you will inherit the earth. And again, this might not make sense until you realize that the Beatitudes are not some Pollyanna mumble jumble. Okay? They're not some, now, everything's going to be right, placid, passive promise. Okay? That's not what it is, because Jesus is beginning his master class right here. Okay? The Beatitudes, instead, are an active proclamation. An active proclamation about the kingdom of heaven that's just starting to break forth. Even though life is not perfect, even though life has its challenges, the kingdom of heaven is near, and you guys are going to see it. So it's an active proclamation, and it's also a call to get going and be active and be at work to transform our present world and transform our present reality into something that's closer to God's desires, something that's closer to God's dreams for us and for the world. You know, who knows? Before the Sermon on the Mount is done, Jesus might talk about crazy stuff. He might later on tell his disciples how to pray. And then he says, when you pray, use these words. Pray like this: Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Imagine if that's I wonder if that's in the Sermon on the Mount. It would be amazing if it was, Rick, wouldn't it? Here's the other thing that we forget about, because we think Christianity is this grand, big new thing that just burst forth with Jesus, okay? But Jesus is teaching his disciples something that they already should know. Okay? Jesus is teaching the proclamation of the prophets that is echoed down through the centuries for those who worship and those who love and those who serve the Lord God. Those who love and worship and honor the God of Israel. Now, this happens every 3 years when we hear this part of the Sermon on the Mount. It's coupled with a passage from the Old Testament. All of our scripture passages are on Sundays. Today, it's coupled with a reading from the prophet Micah. Okay? You may have heard this before, but I'm going to give it to you again. Okay? Micah 6, he starts out, "Hear what the Lord is saying. Arise, lay out the lawsuit before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. With what should I approach the Lord and bow down before God on high? Should I come before him with entirely burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and with many torrents of oil? Should I give my oldest child for my crime, the fruit of my body for the sin of my spirit?" How should we approach God? That's what he's asking. Oh, here's the answer. He has told you, human one, what is good and what the Lord requires from you: to do justice, embrace faithful love, and walk humbly with your God. So, to follow Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, means that we listen to what Jesus teaches and that we actually do it. And guess what? So much of what Jesus taught was already present in the law and in the prophets, like the prophet Micah that we just heard. So as Jesus begins his Sermon on the Mount, his discipleship orientation session, he starts with the Beatitudes. You're in a really good place when you're hopeless. You're in a really good place when you grieve. You're in a really good place when you are humble. And remember, the Beatitudes are not statements that are some passive drivel here, okay? The Beatitudes show us the power and the blessing of this supremely fortunate place with Jesus. They show us that this can be ours as we live into this kingdom of heaven that Jesus talks about, the place that Micah and so many other of the prophets envisioned. Rick, did I say there wouldn't be a test? No, I didn't say there wouldn't be a test. I'm going to move you back to the back pew where you usually sit, okay? What does the Lord require of those who worship and love and serve God? Remember? To do justice, to love faithfully, to walk with a humble heart in God's sight. And friends, when we live this way, we can transform our world. Now, at first glance, we might think that a place that is not at all like the kingdom of heaven is a federal prison. Okay? We might think, oh, that's the farthest place away from heaven. Yet, as Rick Ormsby and as Al Trell said, morning Al, maybe afternoon Al, as Rick and Al can tell you stories, there are times when it seems as though heaven can break forth behind prison walls as they've experienced their work in prison ministry. Okay, no, Rick was not in prison, Jody. Okay, he was doing ministry there. You were doing ministry there, right? Well, he says, no. We go back a long way. But with that in mind, I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine, okay? Chuck Butler. Chuck Butler was a friend and a colleague. Oh, I'm sorry. Those of you watching online, those who are here, I didn't say his last name, okay? So I don't want to say his last name because you're not supposed to know who this guy is. Okay, but Chuck was a friend and a colleague who was a member of the Iowa Conference, okay, of the United Methodist Church. Chuck was born down south, And by the end of World War II, he was stationed at Fort Benning down in Georgia. Now, eventually, he answers God's call, and he becomes a missionary in Panama. And then after his work as a missionary in Panama, he comes back to the States, and he serves United Methodist churches down in Alabama and in Iowa. So that's Chuck, his background. But I got to tell you, Chuck was a friend, and Chuck was a great guy. He was deeply spiritual. He was in love with Jesus. And Chuck had a tender heart. Rick, did Chuck have a tender heart? Yeah. Same was true for his wife, Marilyn. Remember Marilyn? Yeah. Now, after Chuck retired, we began hearing about something called the School for the Americas. The School of the Americas. Okay? Now, if you remember, go back into that Wayback Machine, about 25 years ago, the news started coming out. Where the School of the Americas, this was a place where our country trained soldiers from Latin America, and then they'd go back. But the trouble was that some of these soldiers who returned to their countries, they did terrible things. And hundreds of people were killed. People went missing. We had a term called the missing back then, or even worse. Back to Chuck. If you remember, Chuck was a United Methodist ministry in Panama. And Chuck knew these people. He knew the families of the missing. He ministered to them. He cried with them. He knew the years that they spent wondering what happened to their loved ones, maybe never finding out. So then fast forward years, and Chuck learns that the School of the Americas is training these people. And it's located where? Fort Benning, the place where he spent a couple years, the place he loved. So Chuck, he joins a protest against the School of Americas. Okay? And he got arrested. And when they arrested him, they told Chuck that if he ever came back to protest, they would throw him in prison. Have you guys ever known any United Methodist pastors? So yes. Yeah, if you've ever known a United Methodist pastor or two, you know what comes next. You should see the smile on Rick's face. Okay? A year later, what does Chuck do? He goes back down for another protest. Okay? Now, this was the protest, as he was explaining it to me at the time, is that hundreds of people would show up outside the gates of Fort Benning, where the road is, and they'd walk up, and they'd all just fall to the ground, and they'd just lie in the road as if they were one of the hundreds and hundreds of the missing. Okay, so they blocked the fort. So the police or military police, they come and they get them up, okay? They kind of arrest them, they load them on buses, and then they take him into town to the city park, and they just let him go in the middle of town. Did I mention Chuck was a United Methodist pastor? So it comes time for Chuck to get off the bus. He gets off the bus, and he finds the first police officer by the door, and he says, "Hey, you promised that if I came back, you'd throw me in prison. Here I am." Well, they had no choice. It was a promise. Months later, he told the same story to the judge. And you know what? The judge agreed with Chuck. Okay? And he sent him to federal prison. Federal prison over in Waseca. You guys know where Waseca is? Yeah? It's a women's prison now, but back then it was a men's prison. Okay? And this is where the story gets interesting. Because, I don't know if you can imagine this, but Chuck, he caused some trouble over the Waseca prison. You see, he was part of an accountable discipleship group down at Christ United Methodist Church at the time. Okay, that's kind of like the group that meets here on Tuesday nights. Okay, we use a different name, but it's accountable discipleship. Okay, and the members of Chuck's group took it upon themselves to visit him. Okay, remember that line of Jesus where he says, "I was in prison and you visited me." They took it serious. Okay, and I can't remember the details, but it seems to me that the members of his group took turns. So each day, just about each day, someone from his group would drive over to Waseca and visit him. Okay? And you can guess that Chuck and Marilyn, they are loved by the members of Christ United Methodist Church. So in addition to the small group, there's even more people at the church who are making the trip over to Waseca to see him. That was not a good thing. Because Chuck gets all these visitors, he's smiling, he's laughing, they're having a good, they're even praying together. It was crazy, it was nuts, okay? And it got so bad that the administration of the prison made a rule restricting who could see Chuck, okay? Only his wife Marilyn and his pastor. But it's complicated because remember, he's United Methodist pastor. He's United Methodist clergy. Now he's part of the Minnesota Annual Conference. So his pastor was not any of the pastors down at Christ United Methodist. Rick, who was his pastor? Bishop Hopkins. So only his wife Marilyn and Bishop Hopkins could visit. I think Bishop Hopkins brought you along once, didn't he? Okay. Imagine having a prisoner that the bishop has to visit because they restrict him. You can only have a bishop visit. But that's not even the best part of the story. Do you remember where Chuck was a missionary? Panama. You're paying attention. Thank you. At the time, back in those days, Waseca had a significant number of Spanish-speaking guests. Okay, you know what I'm saying? Okay. So, just think about this. What do you think a retired United Methodist pastor / missionary would do in such a situation having all sorts of free time? Huh? You know what he did? He started a Bible study. But it gets better. Because the inmates in this Bible study didn't just hear the good news of Jesus, they began to live the good news of Jesus. They grew more and more in love with Jesus. Some of the inmates gave their life to Jesus for the first time. And then it gets worse because then these inmates, they begin to love one another. And they begin to treat each other with respect. Think about this. Think about Jesus' teachings. Okay, think about Paul's writings and the subversive effect that they would have in a prison population. Okay? Outdo one another in doing honor. All that kind of stuff. And that place over there in Waseca, it began to be transformed. A federal prison began to feel as if it was a little taste of the kingdom of heaven from God. What was that prayer? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Imagine living in a community like that. Well, as you could guess, the prison administration, looked forward to the day when they could release Chuck. Okay? Because the Federal Correctional Institution in Waseca, Minnesota was starting to feel like a nice place to be. Okay? Instead of a place where someone would be put to punish and just regret what they've done in their lives, they began to, some of them, not all, okay, to be honest, but some of them began to enjoy their life at the Waseca prison. And if I remember correctly, they let Chuck out early, okay, over the protests of Chuck. God bless him. Oh, and after his release, guess what? Chuck became active in prison visitation ministry. And I just spoke to some folks in Christchurch yesterday because I wanted to kind of confirm some of this stuff. And yeah, matter of fact, he still kept in contact with his newfound friends over in Waseca. So that's the story of Chuck, of living the way that Jesus wants us to live in a world that's not perfect. Okay? And where's the rest of my sermon? Got to get my papers straight. So, those disciples on the mountain, Jesus taught them saying, happy are people who are hopeless because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Think about Chuck. Think about the prison. Happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. Could you think of someone who's lost a loved one in the last couple days? Okay. Happy are people who are humble, for they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, for they will see God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they're righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult you and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you, all because of me, Jesus says. So what does the Lord require of those who worship God and love God and serve God? To do justice, to love faithfully, and to walk with a humble heart in God's sight. Now, I know that we here, we're not in a federal prison, are we? No. Betsy says, well, gosh, I mean, I feel like I'm doing my time here. But no, we're not in prison. But you know what? We can still live that way, the way that Chuck lived over there, the way that Chuck lived every day of his life. Okay? We can still live that here in Pine Island, wherever we run around to bring that taste of the kingdom of heaven to where we are. Yeah, if we live this way, we can transform our world. That a good song? Yeah. Amen. You know, when I was a young preacher, we're 3 minutes early, okay? Actually, we're 3 minutes late, but just pretend we're 3 minutes early. When I was a young preacher, first starting out, I sang this at a funeral. It ruined me. I could not sing it for 6 months after that. These words are so true when we know the truth in the kingdom of heaven. So friends, go now to embrace the kingdom values of love, justice, and truth. Go now with God's blessing to live those values through the power of our challenging, faithful, loving, empowering God. Go in peace. Serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.